6 years. What can you do in just 6 years? Could you change the world in 6 years? Probably not. 6 years ago, it was right before COVID for us, and we were in high school as teeny little sophomores. And in 6 years, we started a podcast. But you know who did change the world in 6 years? Alice Ball. From graduating high school to her death, which was sadly just 6 years, Alice Ball invented a technique that would change the world. Intro. Do 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 do.
Alice Augusta Ball was the third child born on July 24th, 1892, to James Presley Ball and Laura Louise Ball. Her whole family were photographers. Her mother, her father, her grandfather, and even her aunt were all photographers. For the time period, and considering they were African American, the Balls lived a pretty decent life.
So, actually, a fun fact about that. On James Ball and Laura Ball's birth certificate, they're listed as African American, but Alice's birth certificate lists her as white because she was white passing, and they wanted to give her a better life, so they listed her as white. And so I guess they were dilute enough that they passed as white.
Were both of her parents African American?
Yeah, I think so, but I think she just was white passing enough. So they were associated with a lot of high profile African American activists and political people. But Alice passed as white, and so fun fact about
that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Alice's grandfather, James P. Ball Sr., was an accomplished photographer in the art of daguerreotype, which involves the use of chemicals to produce images on silver-coated glass or copper plates. Interest in this process is likely what influenced young Alice to pursue chemistry. She graduated from Seattle High School in 1910 and then pursued 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Washington, one in pharmaceutical chemistry and one in pharmacy.
Then upon her graduation, she co-authored the paper Benzylations in Ether Solution that was published in the Journal of American Chemical Society, which was remarkable for the time. Most women, much less black women, were able to achieve such scholarly research and actually receive credit for doing so. The paper that she co-authored investigated how benzyl chloride, so compound, reacted with nitrogen-containing compounds, so amines. So I'm trying to break this down into something more understandable. Do you know how to explain benzyls?
So a benzyl is basically a ring of carbons. So if you don't really understand chemistry or organic or have a background in that, it's basically just a bunch of carbon.
Carbon does not like water. So the whole idea behind this was that she was studying things that would not mix with water. So you have water and oil, they don't mix. So think of lots of oily substances, and she was trying to figure out how other oily substances would work in oily substances, because typically when you do chemistry, it's in a quote-unquote aqueous solution, which is water, but that's not always possible in the body. So she was investigating how oily, fatty, lots of carbony, hydrophobic substances reacted together in environments that had no water in them. And what they ended up documenting was that benzyl chloride first combines with a nitrogen compound and then spontaneously breaks apart into a more stable compound called a benzamide. So I'm not particularly sure how exactly it would work if it was a water solution, but in a non-water solution, the chemicals are bouncing around and then they come together and they're really unstable, but then they break apart into more stable components. And this was important because when they were first doing all of this research, chemistry as a field, at least this level of chemistry, was fairly new, and so they really meticulously recorded their process and described every single variable they could. And this was good because it allowed other scientists to replicate their process and apply it to other experiments.
The University of California and the University of Hawaii both acknowledged her achievements and offered her research scholarships to complete a master's degree. She ultimately ended up choosing the University of Hawaii. I would have too. In 1915, she became the first woman and the first African American to receive a master's degree from the University of Hawaii. So for those who don't know, when you do a master's or a PhD program, you usually research for about 2 years in a master's program and then about 4 to 7 years for a PhD program. and then after which you would defend a thesis. So a thesis is essentially a giant paper presentation about what you've discovered and how it's new knowledge and how it's contributed to your field. So Alice's master thesis was titled The Chemical Constituents of Piper methysticum, and Piper methysticum is more commonly known as kava. So kava is a pepper plant from the South Pacific Islands that has been recently popularized as an alcohol alternative. I feel like I've been getting a lot of like kava ads and like videos from like mindlessly scrolling on TikTok. But anyway, it's been known to induce a state of relaxation, of calm, and mild euphoria when consumed in small quantities. But similar to alcohol, it is linked to liver damage and can cause harmful effects if overconsumed. However, historically, kava has been used as a medicinal plant specifically to treat anxiety and insomnia, which is what Alice was investigating. She was looking at the chemical composition and active compounds, now known as cavalactones.
Shortly after, at just the age of 23, she became an assistant professor of chemistry at the University of Hawaii. That's like kind of, I don't know if the process back then was the same as it is now. If anything, I feel like it was harder back then because it was like, I'm not sure how historically accurate this is, but I'm just imagining like back in the day, like you have like these like old professors who have these years of like knowledge like acquired, and it was less of like, oh, I have this education and now I'm a professor. It's more, I've done this research for so long, let me teach you about it now. But like when we were in college, at least when like my youngest professor, like she was in her early 30s, and that was the youngest professor I had. Like most of our professors are, I would say like 50s, 60s.
Yeah. I don't know. I think now it takes a little bit longer to go through the whole schooling process.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a little more condensed back then.
Maybe. But regardless, she ended up achieving a ton of research experience and becoming like very, very knowledgeable on her subject at an early age in a white and male-dominated field. So it was very difficult for her as well. And during this time when she became an assistant professor, she began studies on cholmugra oil, specifically for the treatment of Hansen's disease, which is more commonly known as leprosy. So let's talk about leprosy. Insert leprosy meme.
Anyway, leprosy is a disease caused by Mycobacterium leprae. Incidents have been recorded since ancient times, and it has been portrayed in biblical literature. Traditionally, leprosy has a very negative stigma associated with it because it was believed that any sort of contact with an infected individual would lead to the contraction of the disease. Now, it's known that it is transmitted through secretions typically found in saliva, so it's spread through breathing, talking, kissing, and coughing. Regardless, in an effort to reduce the stigmatization of leprosy, it has been rebranded as Hansen's disease after the Norwegian physician Gerhard Armorer.
I think it's Armour. Armauer?
I don't know. Armorer sounds
Norwegian.
Looks right. Yeah.
His last name was Hansen. That's the important part.
So he was the one who originally isolated the bacterium. For this podcast, we're going to stick with the term leprosy because it's more well known, and also to encourage you not to think of leprosy with such a negative stigma, and instead a super cool scientific discovery. So leprosy can affect the skin, peripheral nerves, and mucous membranes. Parts of the body can lose feeling, and lesions can appear all over your skin. Nowadays, it's treatable with multi-drug therapy using dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine. I don't know how to say this. Clofazimine. But yeah, multi-drugs. But historically, cholmugra oil was used.
So cholmugra oil has actually been a treatment for leprosy and other skin conditions, namely psoriasis, shout out to me, in Eastern medicine for centuries. It was introduced to Western medicine when British physician Frederick John Mowat, I think that's how you say his name, who was teaching at the Bengal Medical College, learned of Ayurvedic treatment of leprosy using cholmugra oil, which he published a paper on in 1854. There's actually a super long history of cholmugra oil with Indian medicine. There's a whole I don't know if mythology is the right word, but there's a story of how cholmuga oil was used to treat like a couple of people, and these are like in like our like ancient like Indian like stories. But as someone who's Indian, if you're listening to this on the podcast and I don't sound like an Indian person, I am an Indian person. I'm Bengali. But I've always loved medicine, and I love medical anthropology and how like human medicine history, all of that interacts. So this is like really, really fascinating to me. But eventually, cholmuga oil makes its way to the U.S. in the form of topical and oral treatments. Oral was more effective than topical. Topical treatments kind of worked, but if you had the degree of leprosy to which people were concerned about, the topical oil wasn't going to work, or creams. And then some people tried to crush up, so it comes from, I think it's either a root or a seed, but would try and create the oil and either ingest it in a pill form or just take the oil straight. And it was so nauseating, like people would feel sick. Like one patient even specifically said, "Doctor, I'd rather have leprosy than take another dose." So these treatments were kind of working, but not to the point where they were super effective on a global scale. And there was definitely some room for improvement.
So experimentation with intravenous cholmuga oil began, but again, it caused patients so much discomfort and so much pain. It even produced abscesses due to its high density and low solubility in water. If you're like, this sounds kind of familiar, low solubility in water, who studied compounds and how they acted in non-water environments? If you said Alice Ball, you would be correct.
So other than Alice, there were a few other people working on ways to use cholmuga oil effectively in the body. There was an Indian biochemist, Shubhamoy Ghosh, who attempted to make a salt from cholmuga oil that would be converted into a usable compound by the body. Now, when we say salt, we're not talking about like table salt. We're talking about chemical compounds. So I'm going to attempt to break it down super basic level for people who are not so familiar with chemistry. But periodic table, like when you like do like basic high school chemistry, you learn the periodic table. It's composed of elements, and for the most part, not all, but most of the elements have a charge, either meaning that they have too many electrons, or so they would have a negative charge if they have too many electrons, or they have a positive charge if they don't have enough electrons. So a simple salt's going to be composed of compound. It would be, oh my goodness, I'm trying to explain this. Simple salt would be a compound composed of one element with a positive charge and one element with a negative charge. An important characteristic of salt is that they break apart in water, and one of those components one of those parts that were broken could be used by the body, and that's why they would be important. So basically, if you have a salt, it breaks apart, and then one of them is like taken away to your body somewhere, but the other one is like, oh my god, I have this compound that I need, and then you can use it in the body. You can't do that with a fatty, like a very like hydrophobic substance. And so this was the logic that was applied to making a salt from the cholmuga oil. But Ghosh didn't necessarily have a bad idea. Like, theoretically, this sounds like it would work, but unfortunately, when you make a salt from these very hydrophobic fatty acid, carbon-dense compounds, you create a soap. And soaps are also unique because they react with both water and fats in their body. And specifically, they react with lipids. But that's not good, because then it causes your red blood cells to break down and explode. And you don't want your red blood cells to explode. So again, they were forced with an issue of how do they get around this, and how can we make cholmuga oil effective in the body?
How did they find out that was causing red blood cells to explode?
I'm assuming they probably tested in a patient, and then they were like, I'm anemic, and then they like looked at their like blood, and they were like, oh, explosion.
Ow. So, the U.S. Public Health Office in Hawaii, Dr. Harry T. Holman, recruited Alice based on her extensive knowledge of chemistry to help him in cracking the cholmuga oil code. She developed an injection derived from cholmuga oil that ended up using what has later been deemed the Ball method.
I kept writing Bell when I was writing this. I don't know. I think I was thinking of Alexander Bell. Is that a person? Alexander Graham Bell. Did he make the bell? I can't remember. I kept kept writing Bell. Anyways, the ball method.
Balls. Even as people with basic general and organic chemistry knowledge, trying to fully comprehend and explain the ball method is a little bit beyond our means. But a very simplified version is that Alice identified two main components of Chalmugar oil and isolated the active parts. So what we mean by active parts are the parts that are important for fighting leprosy in the body. Since the active parts were not soluble in water, again, they were hydrophobic, she did some complex chemistry to add a compound that was soluble in water, which made the whole molecule in general soluble. So basically, this became an ethyl ester. The derivative of Chalmugar oil is what became injectable and absorbable by the body. When Dr. Hallman tested Alice's ethyl esters, he found that they displayed the ability to kill bacteria. He said, "After a great deal of experimental work, Miss Ball solved the problem for me. From what I found, this wasn't a complete cure, but it worked well enough for the time and was the main method of treating leprosy before the development of another compound, which is referred to as sulfone. Not sulfone, sulfone, which is one of the current treatments for leprosy."
I think the thing that you mentioned earlier, the dapsone, I think that's sulfone. So, like, that's one of the things that's still, like, used today.
That's cool.
But unfortunately, Alice actually never got to celebrate her success in treating so many people. Alice actually died shortly after her discovery on December 31st, 1916. It's believed that she inhaled chlorine gas during a class demonstration of gas masks, which led to her death. But her death certificate, interestingly enough, was altered to state tuberculosis as the cause of death. Now, there's quite a few pictures of Alice. When you look up Alice Bell, there's a picture of her, like, with her grad cap and everything. And that was taken within the year that she died. She looks absolutely healthy. She doesn't, like, nothing is wrong with her. Like, it looks like a perfectly healthy young woman.
That's insane.
And then, like, they just say a year later she died of tuberculosis. So I'm suspecting that University of Hawaii tried to cover up her death. Yeah.
That's wild. Also, the fact that, I guess this isn't really related because this seems more like a university fault, but the fact that so many scientists, especially in the earlier ages when they were still developing things and figuring stuff out, like, died from what they were working on. Like, didn't, Marie Curie
she died from radiation, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so. But that's just insane.
Giving their lives to science for real.
Sadly,
Anyways.
Alice could not rest in peace because after her death, her research was up for grabs. Two men stole her work and gave her absolutely no credit whatsoever.
Typical.
Rosalind Franklin as beep. And they even tried to name her method after themselves. Arthur Dean, the president of the University of Hawaii, who was a Yale chemist, as well as Richard Renshaw, a chemistry professor, were the thieves. Mainly Dean published a paper in 1920, and then in 1922, which was a continuation of Alice's work and techniques, and then named the whole process the Dean method. Gave her no credit, no mention, no anything at all. Dr. Hallman, our homie from before, published a paper in 1922 in which he gives full credit to Alice and calls her technique the ball method. Had it not been Dr. Hallman, Alice's hugely impactful contribution would have been lost to history.
So, something interesting that I found is when he published the paper, I don't know if it was because, like, she was, like, deceased, so she couldn't, like, technically, like, co-author it, but he was the one who published the paper, and then in the paper he was just like, this was found by Alice Ball. So she technically didn't get authorship on the paper, which, like, for science people, like, getting authorship on a paper is a huge deal.
Yeah.
So unfortunately she didn't actually get to author said paper, but he did fully give her credit for it. But despite Dr. Hallman's efforts, Alice still went unknown for many years. But on February 29, 2000, the governor of Hawaii declared it Alice Ball Day, and a plaque in her memory was mounted on I'm pretty sure there's only one Chalmugar tree that's still on University of Hawaii's campus, and they put a plaque on that tree for her. And in 2007, she was posthumously, oh.
I think.
Humor. Homulus? After her death, let's just say that, she was awarded the Regent's Medal of Distinction by the University of Hawaii. And then in 2017, a scholarship was established in her honor called the Alice Augusta Bell Endowed Scholarship, which aims to support underrepresented students. So basically, many, many years after her death, she's starting to get the recognition that she deserves.
I find it absolutely incredible that in pretty much just 6 years in higher education, she made the type of difference that some people spend their entire lives trying to achieve. She was such an intelligent woman, and her contribution was nearly never acknowledged. She was a pioneer in chemistry and pharmacology whose discoveries helped treat so many. Her life represents a message that no matter how much time you have on this earth, you can do something impactful.
The end! Yippee!